Hi guys. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about best practices, and this is something that it's a pretty broad topic, and I am aware of that. However, the topic is not so much, well, rather what I want to talk about is not so much what are best practices, but rather reality, really, like how things actually work in the real world and how best practices fit into that reality. So one of the things that you may or may not notice is that especially whenever Google I/O is running, or there's like some big event with a lot of speakers who talk about best practices and the way you should structure things, and microservices and all of this stuff, basically. Now, the thing is that when you are looking at somebody who is on stage or who is doing a podcast or who's talking about best practices in general, think about something that I don't think is being said enough, and it's actually something that was really difficult for me to grasp when I first started out as a programmer. And I can only look back now and think about the seniors, like the really, really senior developers. I'm not talking like 5 years, I'm talking about 10, 15 years. Like a few people I've worked with who are who probably they probably laughed when I first started, like going on and on about best practices. And I don't know, I hope I kind of have the same idea. I finally arrived at this point in my career where I realized what I suspect they meant when they were talking to me about best practices not being this thing that you should always be doing, and being what they call a little bit pragmatic. And I think I actually finally arrived at that point. And what I'm saying is that when I first started, I watched all the tech talks, and I mean all the tech talks. Like, I logged so many hundreds of hours watching YouTube videos and like everything I could consume. And I still watch quite a lot of them. But especially in the beginning, when you don't really know so much, you don't have much in terms of experience, you kind of, at least I do, I go with the experience of others, like more people who know more than me. And that's something that I've always been doing. Unfortunately, what I'd failed to grasp was that when somebody's up on stage in front of like 100 people and they're trying to sell a concept, it's very much like what movies do with things like hacking, or like doing like chemical processing, like how the investigative shows who do like blood tests in a matter of seconds rather than hours or days, which is the reality. And the same thing goes for hacking. I mean, how many movies have as a main plot, like a part of the plot, that some person hacks into the CIA or FBI database in a matter of seconds, right? I can tell you, for those of you who actually believe that, I can tell you right now that doesn't happen. Or rather, if it does happen, we are so screwed if there are hackers that that can do this type of stuff. But for the most part, I'm pretty sure that this doesn't happen. Now, that's the same thing. Like the person who's selling the concept, like they are trying to motivate and engage you into like adopting these practices because, hey, they want to do a good tech talk. The problem comes when your mindset becomes that the way that they are thinking and the way that they are presenting how you should build your code is the way that everything should work. Now, hear me out on this. What I mean is that when you're sold a concept, let's say that you are sold functional programming. What happens when you have a project that is completely object-oriented and you don't have that seniority to kind of look at software development as a craft? Well, what you're going to do is what I did, and what even people I worked with who are much more experienced than I am did as well. you're going to start telling everybody to refactor everything, because now all of a sudden this code here isn't good anymore and you have to write it in functional, because if you don't write it in functional, the whole application is it's just a matter of time before the whole thing collapses, right? Great. Now all of a sudden this thing that was, I'm not saying perfect, but was working, and the way that you have been building things so far is now no longer best practice, and therefore in your mind it's no longer good code. And that's where the mistake comes. You assume that just because, well, you're not assuming, but you become convinced that the best practice, that idea that somebody sold you, now needs to be the way that everything works, and therefore you go into another problem, which is, you try to rewrite and you try to structure things. This is usually where I argue that you see a lot of splintering in the code base. I actually do go as far as to say that any non-trivial code base is in its constant state of transitioning from like one way of building things to like another way. It's basically like a gradient where you can see over time that some parts of the code are legacy code, and some parts is built in a more modern fashion. And some people get a itch in their head when they see this, because they have this idea that that being consistent is extremely important for the code base. And I can tell you right now, that is not true. It is not true. You can have object-oriented programming concepts and functional programming, for example, in the same code base. There is absolutely a possibility that happens. Just as you can have, maybe in your head this looks like a complete mess, and maybe it is. Maybe that's the case. But unfortunately, the reality of how things are is very much how we think about creating world peace or something like that. You're being sold the idea of a utopia, like the ideal of how things should be working. Unfortunately, it's very rare that things pan out as well as they're being sold in these tech talks. Now, that being said, I'm not saying that you should ignore best practices, but I'm saying that you should continuously ask yourself the question, this best practice here, yes, I see that I could apply it, but is it really valuable for the project? I can give you an example that actually happened to me just today. One very common best practice for which a lot of people I think would agree, is that you don't use hard-coded string values in a switch statement or something like that. You break these things out, especially if there's reusage, so that they point to a variable instead. And the idea behind that is partly that it's cleaner, but also that if you're changing one string in one place and all of a sudden you have to go to all these other places and change that string. Now, I was working today and I had a piece of code in my hand in front of me, that had been using hard-coded string values. And it had been used to the degree that it kind of was like, it meant a lot of work for me to change this to a best practice. And as I was looking through the whole code, and I realized that, hey, this is a fairly isolated scenario, and the value of making this into like variable constants, yes, there is absolutely a value here, but the value isn't so great that that the risk of changing this or the work of doing it will justify the time invested to do this. Now, I might change my mind in the future, or maybe I was just lazy, but like that's the way that best practices are, ignored, if you will, or they're not implemented in for whatever reason. And people do this all the time. I mean, my colleagues do it, I do it. The best programmers in the world are not always thinking about every single best practice that there is. And so what my advice to you is, or rather what I would like you to take away from this little rant of mine, is that as you go along, you will learn what's good and what's bad to do in a given situation. And sometimes even the best practices are not, they're not that necessary to add into the code base. Even though somebody who is really, really high profile, like Martin Fowler or Kent Beck or, I don't know, Uncle Bob, like you can name your favorite programming your profiles, even though they are selling you that this is best practice, and they are right in many ways. Remember that they are selling you a utopian vision, and very rarely is it the case that always applying best practices is going to be the way to go. It's better to be, like, in my opinion, to be pragmatic and let experience teach you when to apply a best practice and when to just solve the problem in a quicker and dirtier way.